Over the past 15 years, 3 consecutive United States presidents have publicly committed to reducing the country's military footprint in the Middle East. The consensus across multiple administrations was that American forces were too deeply entangled in attempting to reorder Middle Eastern societies. Defense planners and economic advisors argued that national resources needed to pivot toward rebuilding America's domestic industrial base and confronting the rapid technological and military rise of China. Yet, Washington is currently mobilizing to wage another war in the greater Middle East. The operational reality on the ground has entirely subverted the stated geopolitical strategy. The current phase of the conflict is defined by a severe asymmetry in military economics. Iran has deployed fleets of unmanned aerial vehicles, heavily relying on drones that cost approximately $20,000 to manufacture and launch. These low-cost munitions are actively threatening the trillion-dollar economies of the Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC. Gulf states, particularly hubs like Dubai, have spent decades transforming their deserts into global logistical and financial centers, investing heavily in transport infrastructure and artificial intelligence. A $20,000 Iranian drone targeting a multi-billion-dollar refinery or AI logistics hub forces the deployment of advanced anti-air defense systems. Every anti-drone interceptor shot over the Persian Gulf represents a massive financial disparity. The damage extends beyond physical infrastructure. In places like Dubai, the entire economic model relies on the promise of an open, stable, and easy environment for global capital. As Iranian strikes widen across Arab countries in the Gulf, that foundational stability evaporates. Oil and gas producers face supply threats, and the broader business community confronts unsustainable risk premiums. The strategy, orchestrated by Tehran, operates on a hostage dynamic. The regime that came to power in 1979 by taking American diplomats hostage is now attempting to hold the global economy hostage by threatening the shipping lanes and energy production facilities of the Gulf. Iran aims to spike the price of crude oil. The immediate secondary effect of a global oil shock is domestic inflation within the United States. This economic pain is designed to divide American public opinion. The Iranian calculation relies on American voters feeling the financial strain at the gas pump and subsequently demanding that Congress and the president justify another costly intervention in the Middle East. In the short term, this strategy has generated a severe backlash. Gulf states have grown increasingly incensed at the Iranian strikes, effectively providing the United States and Israel with the regional legitimacy required to wage a military campaign. However, Iran's objective is to prolong the conflict. A protracted war exponentially increases the financial burden on the global market and the Gulf states. While the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government may have anticipated a swift operational victory, an extended timeline fundamentally changes the equation. As the war drags on, the economic disruption will likely force Gulf nations to pressure the United States to de-escalate, simply because the instability has become too expensive to bear. To evaluate the long-term consequences of this entanglement, military strategists often examine the only country in modern history whose global reach matched the contemporary United States, Great Britain, at the turn of the 20th century. In the late 19th century, the British Empire was the world's sole superpower. Its share of global gross domestic product reached approximately 25%, an economic footprint roughly equivalent to the United States today. London operated as the undisputed financial capital of the world. The British military had previously thwarted Napoleon's ambitions to dominate the European continent and successfully contained Russia's territorial expansion into southeastern Europe During the Crimean War, the empire spanned the globe, effectively setting the agenda for international relations, much as Washington has done over the past several decades. However, between the 1880s and the 1920s, British foreign policy became consumed by peripheral crises. London found itself continuously responding to power vacuums, regional instability, and hostile regimes across Asia and Africa. British troops were deployed to assert control in Sudan, Somalia, Iraq, and Jordan. At the time of deployment, each of these missions appeared strategically compelling and morally justified. The cumulative effect of these interventions was a fatal distraction. The British government was forced to manage an endless series of local crises far from its core strategic interests, often at an exorbitant financial cost. The Iraqi rebellion of 1920 provides a precise historical metric. Suppressing that single uprising required the deployment of more than 100,000 British and Indian troops. The financial cost ran into tens of millions of pounds. To contextualize that expenditure, the cost of putting down the Iraqi rebellion was roughly equal to the estimated total budget for public education in Britain during that same period. While British parliamentary leaders passionately debated the nuances of military strategy in Mesopotamia, they fundamentally neglected the tectonic shifts occurring elsewhere. As British forces battled tribal insurgencies in the Middle East and Africa, the United States was quietly constructing the most advanced industrial economy the world had ever seen. Concurrently in Europe, following the devastation of World War I, a defeated Germany steadily rebuilt its industrial base and developed a highly mechanized military apparatus. Great Britain was systematically surpassed at its industrial and technological core because it allowed itself to be distracted by the chaotic periphery. The historical conclusion is stark. The British Empire collapsed as the world's leading power, not because it was conquered by foreign armies, but because it overextended its finite resources in peripheral conflicts while neglecting its domestic foundations. The United States currently possesses a global military and economic capacity that matches or exceeds Britain at its peak. Yet it is succumbing to identical imperial temptations. Washington continues to respond to genuine crises in the Middle East, driven by a combination of political, military, and moral logic. However, grand strategy fundamentally requires the prioritization of finite resources. The United States does not possess infinite political capital, military bandwidth, or economic resilience. Every administration hour spent debating the complexities of Iranian political succession is energy diverted away from the two primary challenges defining the 21st century: Beijing and Moscow. The indispensable strategic role of the United States is to anchor the global security system against the revisionist ambitions of Russia and China. Neither of those nations is currently deploying combat troops to police the Middle East. China is actively avoiding Middle Eastern quagmires. Instead, Beijing is relentlessly directing its capital into the development of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, solar and wind power, advanced battery storage, and robotics. These specific technological sectors will determine the balance of global economic and military power in the coming decades. Russia, meanwhile, remains fiercely committed to disrupting the European security architecture and undermining Western democracies. Moscow relies heavily on hybrid political-military warfare, deploying tactics that are inherently difficult to detect and complex to defeat. While Moscow and Beijing actively dismantle the basic architecture of the American-led world order, Washington is preparing to spend further blood and treasure policing the Middle East and attempting to determine the political leadership of individual nations within it. History demonstrates that great powers frequently succumb to the allure of small wars. The vast disparity in military hardware tempts the stronger nation into believing it can achieve quick political and moral victories. In practice, these tactical battlefield successes rarely translate into durable strategic gains. More often, they represent the first stage of long-term national exhaustion. Even if a direct military intervention in Iran were to achieve its immediate objectives, securing the country would require the United States to remain deeply involved in its domestic administration and stabilization. The core geopolitical question is whether governing Iran is the optimal use of American time and energy over the next decade. Understanding the trajectory of the conflict requires an examination of the internal dynamics driving Iranian decision-making. Analysts observe that the current posture feels akin to a coup executed by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. The military faction, the individuals controlling the armed apparatus, now effectively hold primary political power. The IRGC has closed ranks around the son of the supreme leader. Under this consolidated leadership, the regime has reverted strictly to its original revolutionary principles. In recent major addresses from the leadership, there are no new policy ideas and no references to economic modernity. The language is heavily reliant on concepts of martyrdom and resistance. This specific ideology has driven Iran into severe economic and diplomatic isolation, and polling suggests it is an ideology that the majority of Iranian civil society no longer supports. To evaluate the longevity of this leadership, regional scholars often reference Ibn Khaldun, a 14th-century North African scholar who observed a consistent pattern in the lifespan of empires. Khaldun noted that empires are typically built and destroyed over a cycle of 3 generations. The first generation operates as the builders. The second generation consolidates the gains. The third generation squanders the inheritance. The current iteration of Iranian leadership represents this third generation of the Islamic Republic. Consequently, foreign policy analysts expect the current leadership to function primarily as a transitional figure rather than a powerful, multi-decade ruler like the initial founders. Yet, cornered regimes facing generational transition and severe domestic unrest often represent the highest risk of regional escalation. Once a nation initiates a wide-scale conflict, terminating it becomes highly complex. Iran maintains distinct geographical advantages over the United States and the GCC. Iran operates as a mountainous fortress, allowing it to house and launch rockets and drones relatively securely. The GCC nations, characterized by flat desert terrain, lack natural defensive barriers. Previously, the GCC believed American military bases provided an adequate defense shield against Iranian assets. Recent drone penetrations have demonstrated that American bases struggle to fully defend their own perimeters against swarming low-cost munitions. Furthermore, Iran maintains the capacity to close the Strait of Hormuz. This maritime choke point is critical for the GCC's survival. They export crude oil to Asian markets through the strait and import necessary food supplies in return. If the United States were to abruptly abandon the conflict and withdraw from the Middle East, Iran would be positioned to demand massive financial reparations from the GCC for war damages. By controlling the Strait of Hormuz, Tehran could implement a toll or tax on all passing vessels. The trillion-dollar revenue streams that previously flowed into Western financial markets would be redirected to Iran. Iran would likely use these funds to repair its economy and rapidly industrialize, positioning itself as the undisputed regional superpower. Israel, possessing a nuclear arsenal, would eventually be forced to sign a regional peace treaty directly with Iran, entirely bypassing American involvement. While traditional geopolitical analysis focuses on resource allocation and historical overextension, there is an alternative analytical framework currently circulating among strategists: the law of eschatological convergence. This perspective suggests that the current war in the Middle East appears irrational strictly from a realpolitik perspective, but aligns precisely when viewed through the lens of overlapping religious prophecies. According to this framework, various global actors are actively attempting to trigger events that fulfill their respective eschatologies, the theology of the end of days. Under this specific model, certain events are predicted to unfold over the next 2 to 4 years. The first projection is that the United States will be forced to deploy ground troops. Sustaining a ground war in the mountainous terrain of Iran would likely require the implementation of a national draft in the US. A draft would generate massive resistance among the American youth, leading to widespread protests and civil unrest. To maintain domestic order, the US government would have no choice but to deploy the National Guard onto American streets, creating the specific conditions for severe internal civil conflict. Simultaneously, the economies of the GCC are slated for deliberate destruction. The intent is to collapse their financial relevance. This economic vacuum is necessary for Israel to achieve the Greater Israel Project, a territorial expansion requiring the absorption of the GCC alongside parts of Turkey and Egypt. Greater Israel refers to the specific territory that Israelites believe was promised by God to their ancestor Abraham. In this scenario, Turkey and Saudi Arabia will enter the conflict and suffer tremendous losses, a move designed to systematically weaken the primary Islamic opposition to these eschatological outcomes. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is predicted to be destroyed during this phase. The convergence theory also incorporates the rise of Persia. For the eschatological timeline to proceed, the Islamic world must unite against Israel for the end of days conflict. Consequently, an Iranian victory in the initial conventional war is acceptable within this framework because surviving the war activates Iran's deeper Persian identity. This is vital for the predicted war of Gog and Magog, where Gog is heavily interpreted by theologians as an alliance between Persia and Russia. Together, they are prophesied to march against the new geopolitical center. The ultimate outcome projected for Israel is the establishment of Pax Judaica, which is distinct from the physical Greater Israel Project. Pax Judaica represents a centralized global governance structure, heavily reliant on artificial intelligence, surveillance, and digital tracking, referred to in religious texts as the mark of the beast. Following territorial expansion, global capital and advanced technology sectors will migrate out of the West and into Israel to build this infrastructure. Corporations commanding AI and data, such as NVIDIA, Oracle, Microsoft, and Google, are projected to transfer their operational headquarters to Israel, shifting the global center of technological power away from Silicon Valley. Simultaneously, this framework predicts a Russian victory in Ukraine. The Ukrainian conflict is interpreted not merely as a border dispute, but as a mechanism to fulfill Orthodox Christian eschatology. The operational goal is the total destruction of Europe and the dismantling of NATO. This destruction is required for Russia to achieve the Third Rome prophecy, centralizing Orthodox power in Moscow following the fall of Western Europe. Additionally, there is a projection that Greece will engage in a war against Turkey, supported by Russia, resulting in the return of Constantinople, Istanbul, to Greek control. Whether one adheres to Fareed Zakaria's historical analysis of imperial exhaustion or Professor Zhang Shichin's eschatological convergence, the immediate structural dilemma for the United States remains identical. If the initial U.S. military engagements against Iran were simply a miscalculation born of arrogance, an assumption that Iran would fold as easily as other regimes, the strategy has already failed. The administration is currently losing the containment battle and operating out of panic. If the US chooses to declare a superficial victory and withdraw its forces homeward, the domestic American economy faces catastrophic exposure. The entire US economic structure is deeply intertwined with the stock market, global financial instruments, AI development, and massive capital investments flowing from the GCC. If the GCC economies collapse or fall under Iranian taxation via the Strait of Hormuz, those financial lifelines vanish. The ensuing economic collapse within the United States would likely trigger a domestic revolution. Given the choice between domestic collapse and foreign entanglement, defense planners will likely choose to send troops to Iran to delay the economic reckoning. The tactical successes of drone interceptions and targeted airstrikes offer the illusion of control. However, the gap between what is known about the immediate battlefield and what remains deeply uncertain about the long-term economic fallout will define the next phase of this decade. Because in conflicts of this scale, the first explosions merely capture the headlines. It is the second-order economic and systemic effects that permanently redraw the map.